Hello, and welcome to Prescott Chorale's Singer Session number 3. Originally, this session was going to be about rhythm training, and counting, but I felt it was important to study voice a little bit more than we did in the very first session. So, I've decided to make this a vocal pedagogy session. You know, there are a number of books written about voice study, voice technique, voice pedagogy, and I thought rather than give you a book to read, I would bring a professional in to give you some wonderful help in voice production. We're all struggling to get our voices back to where they were in March. So, for today's session, I have invited Emily Spencer. Emily is a soprano soloist. Fortunately, she lives here in Prescott, and she teaches voice and vocal pedagogy. Emily will be singing with the chorale in May on the Dan Forrest Requiem for the Living. So, I'm going to welcome to the camera Emily Spencer. Emily, it's good to have you here again today.
To be here.
Thanks.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm excited to get to share some vocal pedagogy principles. I come from a bel canto orientation, so some of the things that I share I think are just good foundational techniques that can apply in many different vocal styles, although I want to acknowledge that you might make different choices based on the style that you're singing or a certain effect you're going for. But what I'm going to share with you is, like I said, the bel canto school of singing, and it will give you healthy vocal production. So, the very first thing we would start with, as you might imagine, is going to be body alignment. Your body is the instrument, and so you want your body to be lined up just right so that it takes air in efficiently, healthily, and most importantly, freely. We want a void of tension. If there's tension in your body before you've even started singing, then we're not set up optimally. So I want to give you some pointers that you may not have thought about when you go to sing. The very first thing, and if you have some space to play around, you might want to stand up and try these principles and exercises with me. But one thing that I have found a lot of singers don't think about, and this is coming again from that framework of my body is the instrument. So considering that, just stand, if you're not standing already, and consider your body, how it is in space. And I want you to pay attention to your feet. And you might think, feet, what does that have to do with singing or vocal folds or breathing? Well, you'll be surprised how much. So as you stand, shoulder width apart, notice where the weight on your feet is. And are you front of center? And I'm exaggerating. Let me turn this way so you can see. Front of center, I'm making that very obvious for you, hopefully. And back of center, where does your weight fall when you're just standing naturally? It will be different for every person. I think most people tend to be a little front of center, but not everyone. But especially if you bring old ideas to your singing, even subconsciously, about being very erect and sternum high, and we hear all these things which there are reasons behind them, but sometimes we can tend to exaggerate those things and it pulls our balance off. And so, excuse me, if I'm thinking of keeping my sternum high and I'm front of center, why don't you try that? Exaggerate that a little bit so that you're front of center, and then pay attention to what that does to your abdominal region. So in my body, I notice that my abdominal musculature engages. Have you ever played the game Jenga? Think of those blocks that are stacked, and if you've played it, you know. The players go around and they remove a block here and remove a block there, and the object of the game is to keep the tower of blocks standing as long as possible. And it gets more and more precarious as more blocks are pulled away. And whoever pulls that block that makes the tower finally tumble and fall loses the game. So you want to be very careful about where you pull the block from so it stays balanced. I kind of think of my body that way. If I'm off center, front of center or back of center, this scaffolding that is our beautiful muscular suit over our skeletal system is very naturally going to engage and grab to keep you from tumbling like the Jenga tower. Okay? If you didn't have that muscular scaffolding, you would tumble just like the Jenga tower. So the first thing in my mind is you want to be just sitting very neutrally in space so that not front of center or back of center, because then this scaffolding has to grab to hold you. And I don't want that, because now you can connect the dots and see that this is leading towards breath management and getting that good diaphragmatic breath we always hear about. Well, the more walls you have, the more difficult it's going to be to get that nice, deep diaphragmatic breath we always hear about. So we don't want any grabbing or holding, right? So if I can stand in a way that is neutral and relaxed, and I can just rest squarely and neutrally in space and not have to be holding or grabbing anywhere because I'm slightly front of center or slightly back of center. If all that musculature can be neutral and relaxed in space, you'll be able to get a better breath. And of course, that's the powerhouse of your singing, so very important. This is kind of a silly example, but it resonates with a lot of people. I'll tell them to think of Homer Simpson, of all people. He's not up like this. We think of him relaxed and resting on the couch, and those abs are not engaged at all. That might seem very unintuitive, especially if you're a dancer. Dancers care very much about everything being tight and pulled in. At least that's what my dancer students have told me. I'm not a dancer. But if you just think of very loose, soft musculature there so that you can freely expand. I kind of think of a glass. If I had a glass here and a balloon, and I inserted the balloon into the glass and blew up the balloon, that balloon would inflate, right? It would begin to fill, it would begin to expand. To what point though? Within the confines of the glass. There's walls around it. So all these things about body alignment and how you take in air and the state of your body before you take in that air, we want to remove those walls. We want to take the balloon out of the glass, and it's when you have total freedom, it's a very amorphous feeling. You don't want to feel enclosed or walls or rigidity. So again, as you stand in space, see if you can find that spot where you don't feel front of center or back of center. You don't have to grab, you don't have to hold. It's a very flat-footed feeling. I had a voice teacher that would talk about the tripod. If this was, I'll take my shoe off so you can see this. If this was the bottom of your foot, a pretty even weight distribution between these 2 points and your heel. That's why I never wear high heels when I sing. If I'm in high heels, it immediately throws my body front of center, my abs are grabbing now. So try to be flat-footed, square in space. Another surprising part of the body to tune into is your hip joint, actually. The hip joint, if you pull it back slightly, just play with that. Try it a second. See what that does to weight distribution. You probably can't see this on the camera very well because it's subtle. But when I think of my hip joint going back a little bit, and you might think, well, now I feel rather ape-like. I feel hunched. I feel, it feels a little vulnerable, like I'm sticking my bottom out or something. But actually, I think if you were in the room with me and saw this, I probably don't look as hunched as it feels. But what I do notice is now I'm exaggerating, I've pulled my hips forward, but if I pull them back, I can feel a more even distribution of weight on my feet. And correlatively, this musculature softens. I can breathe better. So these are little subtle things that you might not think of, that you wouldn't think they'd have that big of an impact. But I can hear a huge difference when I listen to my students. And you do this long enough and listen to enough singers for enough years, and you can start to hear, like, I hear tension in your pelvic floor. Yes, I do. I can hear that your intercostal muscles are not loose enough for the rib cage to expand. I can hear that there's rigidity in your soft palate. You can start to hear where the tension in the body is. And the difference in sound when you have a free body with loose, neutral musculature where there of course is some engagement, but you want that to happen as a natural, spontaneous response to the inspiratory breath cycle, not because you're making anything happen. If you're making it happen, my fear is that there's some muscular engagement. And anytime there is contrived or manipulated muscular engagement that's not a natural response to the breath cycle, it dampens and mutes out some of the brilliance and vibrance of your overtones. If you install some simple spectrograph software, you can search the internet. I know years ago Voce Vista was one of the popular ones that was free. But you can watch, and this takes the mystery out of it and makes it very concrete and very black and white. You can see, simply by looking at a screen and watching the wave patterns of your singing, when and where you lose upper partials. And in the bel canto school or classical school, we want a resonance that is called chiaro scuro, is the aesthetic we're going for. And what that means, chiaro means bright, brilliant, vibrant, shimmering. Scuro is the warmth and the richness. Well, we want both, right? But the tendency is when we're up high, we might be very brilliant and bright, but we lose some of the depth and richness. What if you could be bright and vibrant and ringy and still warm and rich at the same time, regardless of where you are in your register? And then in the reverse, the scuro, the warmth, the richness, that resonance, can it still sound ringy and vibrant, even when you're down low? So that's jumping ahead to a resonance discussion, but I wanted to touch on it because it gives you an idea of where this path of a free body and efficient breath management takes you. That is what unifies the registers so that you don't feel, don't experience, and we don't hear these flips in the voice, like now she's in chest voice, now he's in his head voice, these sections and compartments. We want a seamless voice without these registration events. Again, this is, if we're talking about bel canto method of singing, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, sometimes you want a very light sottovoce effect so you can intelligently make choices about what you're doing with your technique. But that's the beauty of it, is if you're knowledgeable and you understand your body, it is a choice and you can sing one way or another at will. So that's why we want, going back to these fundamentals, a very free, neutral body so you can take in that deep diaphragmatic breath that is going to give you the airflow you need for that kind of vocal production. So let's see, we've talked about body alignment, check the weight on your feet, check your hip joints. Let's talk about inhalation for a moment. You've probably heard pedagogues talk about the silent inhale. We want a silent inhale because if I can hear you breathe, and I'm talking about the inhalation part of the breath cycle, we'll talk about exhalation in a minute, but if I can hear a student inhale, I automatically know that there's constriction in the pharyngeal area. When you hear choir directors, voice teachers, pedagogues talk about the pharynx, they're talking about this area. It's part of your vocal tract, and you have the oropharynx, nasopharynx, laryngopharynx. Those are the spaces and resonance chambers behind the nose, nasal passages, those orifices behind, just above the larynx, which is right here, and oro is the back of the mouth. Those combined, we just call the pharynx, but you could break them down into those separate chambers. Well, just try an experiment for me. I'll do it and then you model it back. I'm gonna purposely snatch my breath and inhale rapidly, and notice what you hear. And now when you do it, I want you to pay attention to the soft tissues in the back of your mouth. That is your soft palate. And see if you don't notice, again, we're exaggerating for the sake of illustrating this principle and to give you enhanced body awareness. But if you purposely snatch your breath noisily, I want you to notice this is pretend my soft palate. And I think you'll notice some rigidity, like I call it the claw, because you'll feel the soft palatal muscles engage. So try it again. Inhale noisily like this. And did you feel that palatal arch? Now, we talk a lot about the palate being elevated in singing. And that's not a bad thing if it happens naturally and spontaneously. But if you're artificially manufacturing that, then I know that you're working harder than you need to, and that's not as efficient, and you might still sound lovely, but you won't get those most brilliant upper partials that we really want. That's what vocal scientists call the singer's formant. And if we were watching that spectrograph that I alluded to a minute ago, you would see those partials. This has been some time, so I need to go back and look, but I believe it's like in the 3,200 range. That's when your opera singers are singing, filling huge concert halls and singing above orchestras without microphones. That's hitting the singer's formant. To hit the singer's formant, and you might think, well, that's not relevant in an ensemble context where I'm blending, and absolutely, we're going to be sensitive to our fellow singers, and we have to be thinking in terms of ensemble and not everyone thinking they're a soloist. But I'm talking about just body efficiency, freedom from tension. This applies in any singing context, at home, at church, choir, solo, singing in your car, singing in the shower, whatever the setting. You just want to make sure when you inhale, it's not snatched, that I don't hear noise, because that noise is indicative of friction. If you're just thinking of principles of physics, if I can hear it, there's some constriction somewhere. So let's just boil that down. When you inhale, can you let your body be neutral and at rest so that that breath just very naturally floats in as a natural consequence of physics? I've got to neutralize the air pressure outside my body, inside my lungs. So when you breathe, and your body does a lot of this very naturally and subconsciously, but try a silent inhale. Now you'll have to experiment. When I did that in my body, I felt my intercostal muscles naturally expand, and I felt that kind of amorphous description we were talking about before. I don't feel walls. Everything is free and loose to give way and to expand and move. I'm not making it happen, but it's free to happen spontaneously by itself. You have maybe heard pedagogues or teachers talk about the rose breath. So that's just simply inhaling deeply as though inhaling the scent of a rose. So if someone walked across the floor here and handed me a rose and I took it, that kind of inhale feels different. It's deeper, it's fuller, but it's not forced, it's not muscular. So hopefully you understand these nuances here. We're getting a deep breath. It's a whole body, whole torso kind of inhale, but there's no grabbing, I'm not forcing it. A thought that just occurred to me, those of you who are parents, remember when your kids were itty bitty babies and their vocal folds never tired. Do you remember those days? A baby, especially if you were blessed to have a colicky baby like I did, he could scream and cry and cry and cry all day long, and he never experienced vocal fatigue. Well, being a voice teacher, I found it very fascinating, actually, and this might seem strange that I'm intrigued by these processes as my child cries. I promise I was tending to him and nurturing him, But I did notice, as a voice teacher, the incredible whole-bodied expansion in his little body. And I could feel it up here in the top of his back and all throughout the ribs and this whole epigastric region. Incredible inhale for that vocal production that he came out. And you might think, yeah, but when we're singing, we're going for much more refined sounds than that. Actually, you'd be surprised how primal excellent vocal production is. And in fact, I had a professor who would always tell us, I want primal sound. I want your primal sounds. Because that is efficient and clean. It doesn't sound artificial. You're not manipulating stuff. You know, there are sometimes instances in classical singing where we can listen and we can appreciate the talent we're listening to, but it can be fatiguing. Like, most people don't want to listen to opera for hours and hours endlessly. Well, effortful singing can become effortful to listen to. So we want primal sounds that are very free, not manufactured, not manipulated. My reason for going off on that little tangent is just to say, can you duplicate that kind of whole-bodied expansiveness? I had a voice teacher who would call it, everything feels undulatory, like free to move, free to wave, free to respond as it just moves out of the way for the air you're taking in. There's a principle in physics called the Bernoulli Principle. And I don't know if any of you are science people and know this already, but if I were to demonstrate it, I did not think of this ahead of time, so you're gonna have to imagine with me. Imagine I have 2 sheets of paper here. Now, if you don't have physics background, this is gonna be kind of a trick question. Imagine I had 2 pieces of paper here, and I am gonna blow through the papers. How would you expect them to respond? Now, some of you are saying, well, they're gonna blow apart. You blow through, the breath's gonna push them apart. Well, other people are gonna say they're gonna come together. Well, that's very unintuitive. I'm blowing air in and they're gonna come together. That's the Bernoulli principle. And this is why it's a trick question. It depends on the nature of the airflow between the papers. And if it's a weak breath, the papers would kind of flop and fall to the wayside. But if it's a deep, engaged, steady stream of airflow, it's actually going to suck the papers together. And you'd see them rattle and buzz. Try this at home. Grab 2 sheets of paper, experiment with what you have to do with your breath to get the papers to suck together and rattle and buzz together. Well, that is a simulation of your vocal folds. When you get a deep enough breath and it's free, and then we said a second ago we'd talk about exhalation. When you get to the expiratory part of the breath cycle, and in voice we hear a lot about support. We talk about support. There are different names for it. The Italian school name is appoggio. We call it appoggio, or the lutta vocale, which means the vocal struggle, because you have these opposing forces. Any of you who do strength training and weight training, you learn all about the different muscle groups that work in opposition to each other. That's how the body is designed. It's the same with the breath cycle. So when we inhale, everything moves down and out, lifts, diaphragm contracts downward. It's the only muscle in the body that contracts downward. The intercostal muscles pull the ribs up, and it creates this vacuum by making this space. And the air rushes in to equalize that air pressure. Now, how long can you sustain that? You've taken air in. Naturally, at a point, your body is saying, okay, I'm ready. I'm ready to collapse. And that's the lutta vocale, because the vocal struggle. Because when you're singing, you're trying to sustain that breath cycle. It's longer than just spoken phonation. When it's singing or sung phonation, your phrases are prolonged, right? I don't sustain the syllables of my spoken speech like I would in singing. So I'm trying to suspend or elongate this breath cycle. But at a point, all of us have experienced the end of that long phrase where we're ready for everything to come back down and close in. So that's the lute vocale, or the appoggio, and that feeling of support is kind of like balancing those opposing forces. So when you take air in and send the air back out, the vocal folds are being sucked together, and your vocal folds buzzing is, phonation is the result. When you're speaking, when you're singing, that is what has happened. That breath flow has pulled your vocal folds together. Let's talk about phonation for a second then. We want a balanced phonation. And there's pressed phonation, and that's where you have laryngeal muscles that have jumped the gun and pulled the vocal folds together before the onset of breath coming up through the glottis. The glottis is that space between your vocal folds. And the muscles are just ahead of the game, and we call this hyperfunction because they're already touching before the breath has come through. Sometimes, we don't usually want this, but sometimes as an articulation matter, we might want a little touch of glottal activity to make a vowel clearly heard, or whatever the case may be. So that's like if you go, I tease my students and I say, pretend you made a big batch of brownies and your boyfriend or girlfriend stole the last one. And you feel that little pop. If you try that, you feel it right behind the thyroid cartilage. That is your vocal folds tapping. So in singing, we want a balanced phonation that coordinates breath, flow, arriving at the point of vocal folds coming together right at that moment so that they don't slam together before the air has arrived. Now you have the opposite situation, hypofunction, and that's aspirate phonation. Most untrained singers have aspirate phonation because they haven't learned how to get that breath flow that we're talking about, the supported breath, that appoggio breath that we were talking about a second ago. So there's not this stamina and vigor in the breath string to pull the vocal folds together completely. And if these fingers were demonstrating the vocal folds, if I went to an otolaryngologist's office and he or she scoped me and you were looking up on the screen at your vocal folds, and if the doctor had you whisper like this, what you would see is the back of the vocal folds popping open a little bit. And they call it the whispering triangle because it makes kind of a triangular shape. Well, we hear this kind of phonation all the time. It's the aesthetic and pop singing for sure, because you'll listen to lots of singers on the radio who deliberately are very breathy. And that's how you would summarize aspirate phonation as breathy. And that's a style that some people sing in exclusively. So it depends on the style and the aesthetic you're going for. But from a vocal science point of view, just understand when you make your choices that if you're going for efficiency and a clean, balanced phonation, and if you're interested in things like being able to sing high or being able to project fully and reach the back of the room without pushing, then you care about efficient phonation. And that is, you want your vocal folds to line up perfectly from front to back to front, no whispering triangle in the back. The analogy this makes me think of is a leaky bike tire. There's some air in there, and you can pedal, and you might make it to your destination, but your tire keeps leaking, and so it's just not as efficient of a process. So if you can close the vocal folds, so that, and think of the paper analogy. If you have a clean adduction of your vocal folds, or if you're trying the paper experiment, then that's going to be more efficient phonation. It will feel easier, and you'll project louder, it will be ringier, but without you working hard. Okay, so that reminds me of another principle of phonation that we should definitely talk about. Do you ever feel like you have your speaking voice and your singing voice? These are two separate voices. Occasionally someone will say, no, they feel the same to me. But usually people say, yeah, I have my speaking voice and my singing voice, they're definitely different. They're definitely not the same. Okay, so this discussion is going to circle back and touch on some of what we talked about earlier, and that's the beauty of it. All these principles are synergistic. They overlap. You can't talk about one without touching back on another. But let's just explore this for a second. We talked a second ago about phonation being balanced and sung phonation versus spoken phonation. We talked a second ago about primal sound. Now, when you're just speaking, most of us have very efficient, clear spoken phonation. For most of us, unless you're speaking loudly to a big group for an extended period of time, we don't typically feel tons of vocal fatigue in our normal speech. That phonation is very efficient, you could say. It's not breathy. You probably don't talk like this. But it's not pressed phonation either, unless, like I said a second ago, you're projecting in a loud room for a long period of time or something, then you might have a little more aggression going on here. But normally, that's pretty efficient phonation. Now, we said a second ago that you want your sung phonation to also be free and natural and not tiring. And the only difference is longer phrases and higher pitches. We speak in a lower range than we sing most of the repertoire we sing. But if you're just talking about phonatory processes, we want the same efficiency and the breath support so that you can sustain longer phrases and you can sing higher pitches, but the fundamental biomechanics of what's happening here, the vocal folds reside here and function here, whether you're singing, speaking, whispering, screaming, crying, whatever the form of phonation, the vocal folds dwell here. They're not moving anywhere, and they are still performing the same essential biomechanical function either way. So we want this to be clean and efficient. I asked you a second ago if you want, I lost my train of thought, I'm sorry. If you felt a difference between speaking or singing, I would encourage you to play with them not feeling so different. Because if they feel terribly different, there's probably a lot of engagement going on that isn't necessary to these basics that we just talked about. So try this for a second. Just go through the gesture of inhalation like you're about to sing, let's say, Amazing Grace. So I'm not going to actually sing it, but go through the gesture of getting ready. Now you try this too. Do you feel things like, and hit the pause button, okay? Go through the gesture of inhalation, about to do your onset. Hit pause, freeze. Are you holding? Are you lifting? Did you feel your palate go up? Did you feel your tongue pull back? Very common. Did your eyebrows go up? Now, if you had to sustain or hold that for an extended time and the phonation wasn't happening, you would notice quickly that that's tiring. That's work to sustain and hold all the lifting and pulling. And it's not, those are independent from vocal fold function. So what I'm saying is you don't need it. It's not helping your singing. On the other end of the spectrum, when you get done with singing, is there any feeling of dismount? You know, la la la, I'm singing, holding my high note, ah. Is there any feeling of dismount when you release? Because if so, that might be another clue that you're engaging stuff and holding and lifting and pulling. So if your body is neutral and free of tension, we shouldn't feel this revving up, and we shouldn't feel this feeling of letting go. If so, just explore the idea that you might be grabbing or holding on to things that feel very intuitive, but may not have to do with vocal fold function. So this goes back to the professor who said primal sound. It feels plain. It feels stripped down because you're not doing all the stuff, the arching, the pulling, the lifting. Watch your tongue especially. We think we're making space, And see if you notice, just try that. I'm gonna make a nice open space and feel what your tongue does. Notice your larynx. Do you feel the tongue depress the larynx? Because that muscle of the tongue is much longer and deeper than you think. It goes down the back of your throat. And when I pull my tongue back, I can feel it push my larynx down. That's kind of like sticking a sock in your trumpet bell, because remember, this is where the vocal folds are. So we want to clear that way, not stuff something back in there. So this might feel very unintuitive, but you want the tongue to be a little more forward in the mouth, naturally, restfully. But the spectrograph I alluded to earlier, if you were watching this, you'd see, take the guesswork out of it, and you could watch and see. When my tongue goes back on back vowels like ah, oh, those things that tend to pull, that's the tongue going back and literally acting like a damper, damping out those higher ringy upper partials that we want for the chiaro, the bright ringy part of the formant. So try when you sing to be more speechy. And I've had numerous voice teachers, coaches, and professors who will make their students speak before they sing. So here's a parting thought. I would try before you vocalize to speak the phrase that you're going to sing first so that it feels very plain, very speechy, very unaffected. So I might just say, amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Amazing grace. I'm going to keep it very speechy. The surprise is that that sounds a lot more refined. I don't know what that sounded like to you. To me, it sounds kind of crass because I'm not doing anything. I'm not trying to polish it or fix it. But to your listener, remember, they hear something different than what your brain interprets in the inner ear. So you have to trust how it feels. And the simpler and plainer it feels, even though you think it sounds raw and unfinished, it sounds finished to your audience. So be plain, don't engage a lot of extra work in trying to fix things. Speak it first before you go into singing, and that probably sounds a lot more refined to your audience than you think. Record yourself and listen. There are a lot more exercises and vocalises we could explore on this, but I hope this has given you some fundamentals to play with and explore. So weight on feet, check your hip joint. Are you free to expand and float and open as air comes in and lets that Bernoulli Principle go into effect? Pull the vocal folds together for clean adduction of the vocal folds, efficient phonation that feels easy and simple. That appoggio and engagement of the breath is going to pull those vocal folds together and give you the chiaroscuro, warm and rich, ringy and vibrant, and most importantly, it should feel very easy, very simple, because you're letting that mechanism do the work, not you fixing and grabbing and holding and making it happen, but just let the principles of aerodynamics take over. Thank you for your time. It's been fun to share these ideas with you, and happy exploring.
Emily Spencer, what a joy to have her here with us today. Let me just give you a fact that is true. If you go back to the first singer session, which was about voice production, breathing, posture, and all of the components of singing, I want you to understand that Emily did not listen to that first session. But if you look at that one and compare to what Emily just did, you'll find a lot of similarities. Yes, she uses a lot of musical terms, and she calls them pedagogical terms. That's exactly what they are. But the principles are the same. So Emily, you have no idea what you've just given to the singers. Singers, here's what I'm going to ask of you. We had scheduled some more technical parts of Prescott Chorale. In other words, rhythm and counting and things of that nature. I'm going to ask you to send me an email about the first 3 sessions. Jacob did a wonderful session on listening skills. What would be most beneficial to you while we wait out this virus that's seemingly been put on top of us? Send me an email. Here's what I'd like to propose to you. I'd like to have Emily come back again and bring with her a student so that she can present some concepts and see how this student responds to Emily's teaching. So folks, I'm going to wrap up by saying, please send me an email, and whether you're in Teresa's church choir or my church choir or Prescott Chorale, just send your emails to Prescott Chorale at Reagan, REAGAN.com, and tell us what you need. What would be most helpful to you? And again, Emily Spencer, you have given us an invaluable voice lesson about pedagogy. Have a great, great day.